Hello. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm doing
Welcome,
great.
Rumblers, to a special live stream with my friend Dr. DeClue. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm doing great.
Hey, thanks for coming on. And I've been doing a series of forensic sciences interviews with a lot of my buddies. Dr. Cutler, I put up, and I had Dr. Fabricant from the Innocence Project talking about junk science. We had a DNA expert, we had a fingerprint expert. And I was thinking, as I'm kind of educating myself and the world on this stuff, I said, one of the best experts I've ever dealt with in my entire career is Dr. Greg DeClue. Look at this over here, this side.
How about that? Yeah,
So I'm going to just kind of a brief introduction to who you are and what you do.
sure. So I'm a forensic psychologist. That means that I have a background in psychology, I have a PhD, and specialized training in forensic psychology, meaning applying the science and practice of psychology to legal matters, most often in court cases. I also have a background in police psychology. I worked with several law enforcement agencies doing pre-employment evaluations and other work as a psychologist within a police department. So you could say I work with cops and robbers both.
Well, cops, right? That's funny, and we were associated in the most painful case of my career, I must say,
Ah,
by far.
hmm,
But it's kind of like when you go through these battles, it's like you're in the trenches together. And I think that we had we bond in these trench battles. And that was a false confession case. And I think somebody that was actually innocent was convicted based basically on a false confession. And
hmm.
that's really your area of expertise. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Can you just give us a flavor of how many people that are actually innocent are put there primarily or in part by false confession?
Yes. Of course, there's some unknowns with regards to questions like that, because identifying who's really innocent, who's not, the actual innocence is an issue in and of itself. But within groups of individuals that have been exonerated, for example, through the Innocence Project and other efforts, the number often is around 25% to 30% of people. Again, to be clear about it, somebody has been convicted of a crime and then eventually exonerated, either because it was DNA evidence, something else showed they didn't do it. About one quarter to a third or so of them, part of what led to the wrongful conviction was a false confession.
And the typical reaction, one of the reasons it's so high, is because people immediately say the first thing out of their mouths, and so let's just knock it out front, is they say, "I would never confess to a crime of something I didn't do." What is your
Yep.
response to that?
Well, I think it's a very understandable expectation. And there may be many people who would never confess to a crime that they didn't do. On the other hand, we know that people do. And so you have a feeling about what sounds true or feels right. But then you can look to actual evidence of, are there people that we knew that we can subsequently find out they didn't do it, and they absolutely did. Either they absolutely made a confession and made admissions and confessed, or in cases where it wasn't recorded, the police get up on the stand and swear to tell the truth and say, this guy told me such and such. And if there's no recording, then in that case, sometimes all we know is the police say that he confessed to the case.
Right, and everybody knows the "I shot the clerk," right? Everybody knows the scene from My Cousin Vinny where he says, "I wrote it down." He said, "I shot the clerk," right? And
Right,
there's that.
right, right. Uh-huh.
Um, and I will say that, and this is why we have experts, because I know a little bit and enough to be dangerous and enough
Mm,
to be a little skeptical when you see confession type things. Um, and one of the things that became apparent in the case that we are is we had two factors at work that led to a false confession. Well, multiple factors. One of them was, I would say, low IQ. Second was high, very high in agreeableness. And number three was a trust, an appeal to a trusted authority. They brought in a cop that had a long relationship and they were in a dire strait and trusted that police officer. So before, I mean, I want to talk would you say those are risk factors for false confession?
Yes. So actual innocence is the biggest risk factor for a false confession, because you're not going to get a false confession if somebody's actually guilty. It sounds a little sideways to think of it that way, but I think with regard to everything that we get into more details about what goes wrong when not only somebody falsely confesses, but the police look at it and they think it's a true confession. Prosecutor looks at it, prosecutor thinks it's a true confession, and then either the case pleads out or it goes to a judge or jury, and the person still thinks it's true. So to get to the very beginning of it is, I like to put it this way: two people walk into a room, one of them's the cop, and the other person is either guilty or innocent. There's nothing that the police officer does that's going to change whether that person is guilty or innocent. What goes on during that interview is going to change other people's perception of whether the person's guilty or innocent.
Well, and I have some notes here that were hopefully provided by a friend of mine, who remain unnamed. But and I know that we've had some really bad trials with some really bad police work. I've also dealt with some great police officers who are the thin blue line that protect us from lack of civilization. So there's a whole, police officers are human beings. Some are great, some are terrible, some are corrupt, some are honest. And I want to speak to those honest cops, which are, I'd say, the majority, most, who are afraid. They do not want to get a false confession. They want to get true confessions. They want to get people admitting to what they did, but they don't want to get an innocent person wrongfully convicted. So I'm going to read a question here, and this is the penultimate question that if you don't pay attention to anything else this whole stream, pay attention to this one. Here's the question. You ready?
Sure.
You pretty much told me you could describe a pretty much foolproof method of preventing wrongful convictions from police-induced false confessions. Really?
Yeah.
What is that
of it, and I think if people listen to us talk for a few minutes, we'll see. But I think most people will come to see it that way also.
Well, so what is that method that the police need to use to screen out the false from the true?
So there are going to be several steps to it. So I'll go through the steps kind of one at a time. Then we can go back over it to kind of summarize, because there are a lot of pieces to it. So
Sure.
The first step is that the police should record everything, their entire interaction with the suspect. And that can begin even before the police consider the person to be a suspect. The police might consider the person to be a witness or a person of interest or a possible suspect. And the first recommendation is that the police turn on their recorder, whether it's a body cam, as we have these days, police have these days, many of them, or a handheld recorder, video recorder in the interrogation room. Just record the whole thing. Don't wait until later and then start the recording. I'll explain a little bit why that's so important, but it's a simple step. Just record. The second step is, and this arguably would even come before that step, but even before the police sit down with the suspect, investigate the crime or allegation. When you're not dealing with an emergency situation with, say, a live shooter or somebody who's the crime is actually ongoing, there's often a situation where police can try to find out what happened before they sit down and talk to the suspect. So that can include looking at the crime scene evidence. What do things look like there? What do witnesses say about it? Police will look for videos, and in our society, there are cameras here and there. So to summarize this part is gather information so the police know some of the facts of what happened, and then write down some of those facts. Write down what is known about the offense. So now we have the police do an investigation before they do an interrogation. when they start talking to people, they turn on the recording at the beginning of it, before just right from the beginning, put it that way. They've got a written list of details that are accurate regarding the crime. And then from that written list of details, create a holdback list.
Right.
HOLDBACK. These are details that are going to be held back from witnesses, persons of interest, suspects, that are things that are known to be true about the crime, what actually happened, but would not likely be known by people in the general public, somebody other than the perpetrator or somebody who actually had accurate knowledge of it. So at that point, the police have this, they know something about what happened. They're recording everything with the suspect. They've got a secret list of details that they don't tell anybody about. And then they begin their interrogation. That's all background. Then they start talking to the person. The way police in the US generally do the interrogations, they'll start with a non-confrontational interview, just gathering information. Tell me about your day today. Tell me about your day yesterday. It doesn't start exactly with where were you on the night of such and such, but they kind of lead up to that, getting some background information. And they get the person's story, which might be an alibi that'll check out, or it might be something that if the person's actually guilty and they're making up an alibi, the police might be able to get that. As the police get information from the suspect, if the person considers this person to be a suspect, they think the person actually did the crime, the police are probably going to use various interrogation techniques to try to encourage the person to think it'd be in their best interest to say they did it. I don't want to go off too many tangents now, but
well,
yeah.
My buddy Dr. Brian Cutler, is he is a big proponent of the holdback list, and that is such an essential element that police need to work on. And it takes a little work, and maybe that's one part of the problem, is it's a little extra work, but having a holdback list of details that only the suspect, only the perpetrator could know. For example, on the Idaho killer case, right? That's one of the reasons you're not seeing the quadruple homicide, maybe possible serial killer type thing. And they found a K-bar sheath, a leather sheath with his DNA on the button, right? Well, they held back as much of the detail of the crime scene as you can to hold back. For example, the fact that it was a K-bar knife was the murder weapon. If you know that that's the case, and you hold that back. So if the perpetrator mentions K-bar knife, then you've got something that he has volunteered and put into the scene that is corroborated with the scene that was not revealed prior. And the problem with not having a conscious holdback list, something that's actually written down, is that police will actually reveal those details unconsciously, and then they'll hear it from the suspect and say, aha, right? When they're just getting echoed, because they aren't even aware sometimes what they're revealing when it's not written down and consciously held back.
Yes, exactly.
Because you've reviewed a lot of these kind of interrogation videos. I mean, you've seen examples of that, right?
Right. Yes. And so that what you just described covers at least two parts of this. One, the holdback list, so you have the details, and the other is the essential to why is it so essential to record right from the very beginning? It's not just to reveal whether the police made threats or promises or things like that, but also whether the police mentioned details, maybe even inadvertently. And I've worked on cases where a very crucial detail that the police thought was brought up by the suspect, they did record the whole interrogation. And when we went back through and looked carefully at it, this detail that the officer was convinced the suspect had brought up himself was something the police officer had mentioned, and it even shown him some pictures along the way.
Right.
So,
exactly. Yeah. And the same thing goes with Miranda. And 95% of the time, the Miranda's read and it's no problem. But then the police officer, it's such a routine. I know that this is a thing. And they say, I read the suspect is Miranda rights. They'll write in the report. And then you review the body cam and there's no Miranda read. It's
right,
like, well,
right.
You didn't. And they just, and you can create memories. And I've been talking about this a lot. And this is what I talk with Dr. Cutler a lot about how your brain will rationalize, will reason together unknowns, and then create a memory that you can then reference and say, oh, I know, I can sit here right now and I remember that, when in fact your mind created a bridge and filled in those gaps and gave you a memory that did not exist prior.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I mean, in that regard, with the Miranda, police officer does that hundreds of times in the career. And so on a particular case, they might be testifying about it, or they might write a report a few days later, or even later that day. They might testify about it months or even more than a year later. And their memory, they might trust their memory, but their memory could be a combination of what they actually remember about that case versus other times when similar things came up.
well, I remember one thing in our case that we had that was very bothersome about that. And it's because we had a very agreeable suspect, a person who was extremely high in the agreeableness. You know, agreeableness is one of the big five personality traits. And I'm extremely disagreeable. Whereas this person, it's hard for me to even comprehend somebody being, you know, and I'm on the top 1% here and they're on the bottom 1%. It's kind of hard to look over that chasm. But
Mm.
one of the things I remember the police officer was saying is she was saying, but I don't remember that. But I don't remember that. And at some point, the police officer says, that's not an acceptable answer.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and you were very frustrated by that, and explain why that's a problem.
So why it's a problem to say that's not an acceptable answer. Um, the Let me lead up to that just a little bit regarding the memory and how this comes into play with the suspect. Because when a person is when the charge involves something really serious, a murder, child sexual assault, a rape, people would think, how could you not remember such a thing? And it sounds so um, questionable that a suspect could say, "Well, I don't remember that," and the police officer says, "Well, it's either yes or no," or they push them to take a choice one way or another. What often happens before that point in the interview is that the police will tell the suspect some of the details of the crime or accusation, and we were talking about a holdback list. Not everything, not all the details are held back. So police will sometimes use their sort of all-seeing powers, or the myth of their all-seeing powers, to convince a suspect that, hey, we know you did it. It's now just a question of why you did it. And when we figure out, when you tell us why you did it, maybe it won't look quite as bad as you're a monster who does this all the time, or so on. So the police, even if they're doing things right, or what I would consider to be right and appropriate, they might tell the suspect some of the details of the allegation or the offense. And then the person, if the person's innocent, and they say, well, but I don't remember doing that. And then the police hone in on you've got to say yes or no. You can't say, I don't remember. That doesn't make any sense that you wouldn't remember. Well, one thing that, again, people need to understand there is that not only do the police tell the suspect true things that are known about the event, the police can lie to the suspect.
Mhm.
And this is when people say, like you said at the beginning when we started talking, when people have the background expectation, I would never confess to something that I didn't do. Some people are aware that in the USA, the police will sometimes lie to a suspect and give them a combination of true evidence, false so-called evidence, and try to convince them that we know you did it. When an innocent suspect is faced with, we know you did it, we've got video footage from the scene, or we've got, do you know how touch DNA works? Well, there's this thing, touch DNA. If you touch something, then your DNA is going to be on it. And police kind of tell suspects sometimes a mixture of accurate information and total lies and things that are just a little bit exaggerated. So before the person says, well, I don't remember doing that, the police may have already told him, we know you did it because we've got a fingerprint, or we've got a video, or we've got something, we've got eyewitnesses. And after the police have said those things to him, they say, but I don't remember doing it. If I did it, I would have remembered it. So that's where the I don't remember comes in some cases where an innocent person is being questioned by the police. And then when the police move from, but that's not okay, you can't just say, I don't remember. You have to tell us one way or the other. Then the person is put in a position where the police encourage the person to doubt their own memory for whatever reason and assert with great confidence that the evidence is overwhelming that he did it.
Well, and I remember in our case, we had this woman who was highly agreeable, and was in a situation. She'd been in jail for 80 days on something else and was desperate to get out. And this cop comes in who's a longtime friend of hers. She's known since childhood, and she's like, help me. And then when he's breaking her down, he says, well, your husband told me you did it. You confessed to him. And I remember her saying, he did? And then that's when they're breaking, not remembering is not an acceptable answer, right? And she's caught because here her husband is saying this trusted officer, and she's confessed, and she's down and she doesn't remember. And then the cop's saying to her, that's not an acceptable answer. I mean, it was the most unbelievable and disgusting display, I will say, that I've ever seen a police officer do. And to this day, that case infuriates me. And I know you were up into it, but that really jumped out at me, because just to watch in really less than 2 hours, somebody get broken down and implanted with memories. The police implanted in her brain their version of events that was actually wrong. Her confession, and she confessed it the wrong way. It would be echoing what the police were saying.
Right. Yeah.
So can I, if the police, if you've got a good police officer, and there's a lot of good police officers out there, and they want to prevent false confessions from tainting an investigation, I mean, would you say that recording, investigating, writing down facts, and having a holdback list, just those protections, would prevent the vast majority of false confession convictions?
You're getting there. The number of steps would probably grow to about 6 or 7, but that's a real basis of it. So investigate first, make a list of details, select the holdback list from it. You're recording the whole time that you're talking to the suspect. The actual interrogation method, while some things are considered legally coercive and some are not, that's actually a side issue for this particular analysis we're talking about now. But so however the police get the person to say I did it, if the police do that and get the person to say I did it, then the police should proceed from there. In other words, I did it is not the end of the interview or the interrogation. It's the beginning of what's called a post-admission narrative, which means post means after, admission is when they admit something, and the narrative is when they tell the story. So now once the person has said I did it, and the police talk to them a little bit more, then they say, okay, you've told us that you did it. I really appreciate it. They'll say things like, you're really manning up here, or other things that are encouragement to them. But they say eventually people are going to look at this and they want to understand exactly what went on. And I appreciate that you're being honest with us now. So I want you to tell me the whole story. Let's start again. And then they pick a time. It might be this morning, when you woke up this morning, or a particular time, and just tell us what happened. And now, if the person is giving a voluntary, true confession, then the person should be able to tell some details about what happened. And those details can then be investigated to see if they really match. So as the police ask for details, the key is to use non-leading questions. In other words, don't say, and then you went in and you did this, didn't you? I mean, that would be an obvious, extreme wrong way to proceed, where they tell the suspect what the so-called right answer would be. But instead, it's tell me what you did then, and then what happened after that, prompting to try to get some details into it. What were you wearing? Oh, you mentioned there was a weapon that you used. What caliber weapon? You said that you shot the person. But you don't tell the person there was a shot first. But if the person says, and then I shot him, say, oh, okay. Now, where did the gun come from? Did you have that in your possession before? Did you purchase it? Did you bring it with you? Did you find it at the home? What was the caliber? Where is that weapon now is a real key to it. And you know, if they lead them to the murder weapon lines up and so on, then you're going to get to a statement that, and here's a real succinct way to do it. And the police interrogator from California summed it up this way: is I make the suspect prove to me that they did it through their very own words. The content of their confession statement is going to show that they did it. If it's a true voluntary statement, then they should know some details that most people don't know. People are not going to know otherwise. And then they might even tell the police things that the police didn't know before. Again, like the murder weapon, where's that, and so on. And so if the police record the whole interrogation, the suspect ticks off like 5 of the 8 things on the holdback list in quite detail, leads them to the murder weapon and so on. Now you've got a statement that you can really count on. And so the qualification to, are we going to eliminate false confessions? The qualification is somebody could still just choose to lie to the police and take the blame for somebody else. But as far as the police inducing somebody to give a false confession, that can be prevented. Or when the police get a false confession, that would be recognizable because the details don't match. In other words, the person confesses to a crime, a so-called crime, but it's not what actually happened. It's not the right weapon. They say, I stabbed her when it was really a gunshot. Or
of course, we've seen prosecutors that ignore inconsistent details and parade in front of a jury false. They confessed, even though the cops fed all the details and the details were wrong. We've seen false confessions, you and I, in the situation. So it also takes some integrity on the part of the prosecutors to be aware. I know that's a contradiction in terms, but I will say that, you know, it's important, really, really important for prosecutors and police to be aware that this is a major issue and a major reason why people get falsely convicted. Innocent people get convicted. And I think it's a moral and ethical duty on the part of law enforcement and prosecutors to be fully versed in this and to be aware and sensitive to it, because it is such a dangerous and powerful bit of evidence for the innocent person.
Right. Once there has been a good deal of research that looks at what happens once a person confesses. So once a person confesses, and again, it could be a true confession, false confession, or a mixture. It could be, some confessions have some truth to it because the person did something, but the police managed to get the person to over confess where they say more. But once somebody confesses, more of the cases are going to result in a conviction. The investigation often will sometimes pretty much stop. If they have a confession from one suspect, they're not going to keep looking for another suspect because they figure they've solved the crime. They may not examine the DNA evidence, or they may not continue to gather eyewitness reports from neighbors and so on because, hey, this case is done. Let's move on to this unsolved case where we don't have a confession. We're not sure who did it yet. So once somebody confesses, the whole case can change. And once we realize that there is such a thing as a false confession, then you don't want to just close the book unless you have what I would call a corroborated a detailed confession that has been independently corroborated by other evidence in the case. Then it might be time to wrap up the details and move on and start working on something else.
All right. Well, I've got lots of questions. I'm going to take as much time as you're willing to give me because I just love listening to you, and it's such an important issue that is under publicized. And but I will say that if you're a defense lawyer, I will say like I said, you're the best expert that I've ever dealt with. and your testimony was great, and your analysis is great. You're very clear thinking. Are you still doing consulting? So if an attorney in the United States has a false confession case, are you available?
Yes.
And where would they find you?
So the easiest way is just to do an internet search for Greg DeClue home page. That's easy to remember. Or I'm based in Florida, so you can put Greg or Gregory DeClue, psychologist, Florida, and in a search that will turn up how to contact me.
Now, you've also written a book called Interrogations and Disputed Confessions, a manual for forensic psychological practice. So that's available, on Amazon, most booksellers?
I'm not sure about the availability. That book's a little bit old, and if I weren't, let's see, how should I word this? If I were as ambitious as I was when I wrote that then, or as driven, I would have done an update of it by now. So the book is still quite useful. The part that needs to be updated is more the legal section than the practical part.
Right.
You can find it on my website, which again, I just mentioned, Greg DeClue homepage will get you there. I know somebody described finding it recently, but yeah, look for the book and it
Well,
should
I
be
was
still
just seeing
available.
Rose
Mhm.
on our chat. She's one of our great mods. She's putting together some of your links. So the
Oh,
links
great.
are in the chat. So we have some great people. Corn Pope is here, King Bob, Miss K Griff, Molten Salt, of course, Mr. Logan is here. Let's see,
Mm.
CF Herman, Riggs was right, Chuck Renfro. We've got all kinds of people. Ellie is here. And Ellie has been putting some questions in. And I could be like my buddy Andrew Branca and say, if it's not in the form of a $5 chat, but I'm not going to do that because I love my chats. And she has a very good question, so I'm just going to pick up on it and echo it. And that is, how common is it for family members to take the blame, so to speak, for others? Is that what you see, or is it something else?
So that is a thing that happens. To talk broadly about taking the blame for somebody else, there are several scenarios, and family, if we think of it real broadly, would probably fit. So family could be biological family or family by marriage. People who are in a tight group might be considered a gang, might not be called a gang, will sometimes somebody will take the blame for somebody else. For example, if there are three people involved in a crime, one of them is 15, one of them is 17, and one of them is 20. The 20 and 17-year-old may already have a record. The 15-year-old doesn't have a record yet and might be encouraged by the others who he's looking up to say, hey, you take the blame on this. It's not going to be a big deal. And you're going to have a lot of credibility. And by the way, we'll, blah, 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 blah. So
Right.
that will happen. In cases where a family member takes the blame, I will tell you with confidence that there are cases where a young child was injured or even died, and there's a limited number of suspects. Sometimes it's just mom or dad. Sometimes there's mom, dad, and one or two other adult or even older sibling that's suspected. And in that kind of a situation, there are times that I know for sure that one person will confess to it and then later say, I was taking the blame for the other one. And in some of those cases, we don't ever know who really did it. We know who said they did it. We know who got convicted. But if they say, hey, I took the blame, and then each side kind of says, no, he did it, no, she did it, we might not know. So I can't tell you a number for how often that happens, but it does happen. And the reasons often make sense if you listen to the story.
Now, you're a forensic psychologist. Is that the right word?
Yes.
Now, how did you get interested in that?
So I went through a variety of things through college time. I wanted to be an environmental engineer at first, but that was back in the 1970s. And while that was a thing, they didn't have that at my university. So I took some other courses, dropped out of school for a while, came back. Eventually, I was mostly interested in psychology and philosophy. I wanted to have a job. So psychology seemed like a better option. And my first introduction to forensic psychology, I didn't like it. I didn't like the competitive nature, the challenging part. As an expert witness, you're entering into an adversarial system where you, as an expert, are put up by one side to say, oh, this guy's great, he's very well trained. The other side is going to say, he doesn't have very good training, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And by the way, the field that he's talking about doesn't even exist. So that initially the idea, I was more of a peace-loving person who wanted to get along with everybody, and to go into a courtroom and battle for one side or the other didn't appeal to me. But as I started working with people with real issues, and some of them had been charged with crimes and so on, and I got to working with the police also as a police psychologist, eventually I found it to be one of the most fascinating and important areas, because now you're dealing with, as a forensic psychologist, to bring my knowledge of the science and practice of psychology to help with some of the most important decisions that society makes.
Right.
If it's a major crime, who did it? What's an appropriate sentence for it? Sometimes life and death, where or the death penalty is involved. And so I got drawn into it, not so much because I like arguing with people, but that the nature of what's being advanced is so important, and it's just very interesting.
Right. No, I think I'm with you. And I like the fact, your job really is not required to argue with the other side, but it's to be firmly grounded in the truth and education and reality and experience, and to present that fairly and honestly to a jury. And that's one of the things. Your testimony was always great whenever I seen you, because your credibility is up there. And I think that when people put on these advocacy roles as experts, as even as prosecutors, I think prosecutors need to be much less adversarial and advocates, and much more of a impartial, fair presenter of the facts and the evidence. Same thing with police. When they get put on this advocacy role, the jury is the one that's going to make that ultimate decision. But when you start wanting to put your finger on the scale of the evidence to say, well, I want this particular outcome, that's when the credibility is lost, and that's when the system can be corrupted.
I agree. I mean, we're talking about human nature, because when you're in an adversarial situation, one side's going to win and one side's going to lose, or there can be mixed results where, maybe somebody is found guilty, but the sentence is considered reasonable for the situation. But so for
Of
myself
course, if
as an
the
expert
prosecutor
witness,
obtains a false conviction,
yeah,
they have lost as well. Everybody has lost. The society has lost. The defendant's lost. And I
right.
would argue the prosecutor has lost, because they have failed in their ultimate duty to protect the innocent.
I agree. I mean, there's a case that's known as the Central Park Jogger case.
Right.
Um, so I want to be a little cautious about talking about that, because, of course, we're always talking about real people. The victim in the case has subsequently come out and given her name to the public. The five young men or boys who were convicted, their names are known, and so on. And the general story of that I want to bring up here is that you had somebody in the, I'm going to say 1980s. That's something we could fact check, but where somebody was assaulted and almost died. And the police collected up a group of young men or boys right around the age of majority, teenagers, let's say, and got confessions out of them. So several things went wrong in that case, and with results that were substantial for a lot of people. One of them was that the real perpetrator was not found at that point, and only subsequently, years later, they did identify who actually did that, and the person went on to commit several more vicious crimes. And had the police not so-called solved the case by getting false confessions from those teenagers, they would have continued to investigate, and they might have found the person sooner. There were some reasons why to think that they there were some clues there that were not followed up on that they might have found. So we're talking about there's not justice for the victim because the wrong person is found guilty. The person who's found guilty who didn't do it, their lives are turned upside down. Even if the person, is put in jail, prosecuted, and goes for months or a year or more, and is eventually the charges are dropped or they're exonerated, it's still a total disruption to their life. And then finally, in that particular case, shows an example that if they get the wrong person to stop investigating, then the person who committed the crime may go on and continue to commit really awful crimes.
Right. So this is the duty, and we really careful, objective, reasonable, methodical. These are things that we should be expecting from our prosecutors and our police agencies,
Yes.
and not emotional, irrational, leaping to conclusions, sloppy. And it's frightening because I've been watching since the last year or so. I've been watching these YouTube trials, and some of them are good, but it's amazing how bad some of the police work and some of the prosecutorial work is, and it's scary. And I guess it's just, the humans populate the human systems, and so we're going to have that, but we really need to work very hard to push back. Now, I did want to ask you some more personal questions, if you don't mind. And
Okay.
how long?
I'll answer
Huh?
the ones I feel like answering in that regard.
That's right. Well, not too personal. We're still on a family-friendly channel here. Um, you've been working on confession cases for over 30 years. Is that correct?
Let's see. Around 30 years.
How many cases do you think you've dealt with, as a confession expert?
Mm, well, there's definitely been hundreds. I wouldn't be able to put an actual number on it, but probably somewhere between 200, 400, somewhere in that nature.
Now, so you've got quite a perspective, and there is some value to us old dogs having a little bit of experience, and so that brings the question to you, to is that have you seen changes in police interrogation techniques and training over that period of time?
I definitely have. And some of what reminds me of that sometimes is when I work on an old case. So happens to be that this week, one of the cases I'm working on is a person who is currently on death row in one of the southern states in the United States. I want to avoid identifying information because I'm working on the case right now. The person was arrested and convicted at trial and was sentenced to death. The police did not record any of their interaction with the person. Their interview / interrogation of the person lasted over 7 hours that we know of for sure from the police records and testimony. Again, none of that was recorded. One of the other suspects who had been arrested before that person was, as the suspect himself said, hogtied by the police, thrown in the back of a car and said, "We know we got you. We know you did it." Again, I'm not going to talk about the details of the crime, but and so that person has, described how he was treated. Came up with an alibi that wasn't actually followed through, according to the witness who would have either verified or not verified the alibi. And then the police went on to interview this person who's now on death row, again, without recording. There's no, to my knowledge so far in my work on the case, we really don't know what the police said and did to this suspect. And we don't know how the police got him to go from saying that he did not commit the crime to saying that he did. So we're talking now, that's about 25 years ago. Now, as I get new cases these days, almost all the cases, the police recorded the interview and the interrogation. I've seen progression in terms of how many are recorded and how much of the recording they do. I still see cases where the police begin the interview without recording, and then at some point there's a recording that the prosecutor will see. If it goes to trial, the judge and jury will see. If somebody like me is on the case, I'll see the recording. And so it starts up with, okay, so we're talking about such and such. And like we already talked before we turned on the recorder, and we already told you Miranda warning, and you waived Miranda, right?
Right.
And so now we don't know several things about that. Did the suspect really understand his Miranda rights? And I can talk about that, how to do that.
Well,
if you're
let's
interested in
circle.
that.
Miranda is such a deep pit, and I will say, I've taught classes on Miranda, and I hate to be a bringer of bad news, but I am of the firm opinion that Miranda rights are basically useless, because there's so many exceptions. There's so many ways around it. There's so many ways for the police to defeat it. And I have a chart, and it's about 20 different ways that it can be gotten around. That I have very little. I mean, we've done that with our Constitution over time, but let's avoid that and come back to a point that I wanted to ask you, because you're saying that you're seeing an increased use of recordings, which is the number one thing. Record everything. Is that just a consequence of better technology, and we have better storage devices and that sort of thing? So we have these body worn cameras, or is it an active police move to try to better themselves?
I'm sure it's a combination of things. So the technology is easy, cheap, available, dependable. And so there's really no excuse not to record. There's also the situation where for some individual police departments, they took a case, they wrote up the case and handed it to the prosecutor. Prosecutor proceeds, and either the statement was suppressed, so the jury never got to see the statement because the cops couldn't show that the guy understood Miranda, or the cops the judge doesn't always trust the police when it's just take my word for it, Your Honor. He said this or we did that. So it's partly that sometimes not recording can lead to the police and the prosecutor not getting a conviction. And then it's also sometimes when they got a conviction and subsequently it was overturned and they realized, oh my gosh, what did we do? We got the wrong guy locked up. We don't want to do that again. How can we do that? So you'll have like an innocence commission, which Florida has had, that will make recommendations. They're not always picked up and followed right away, but the gradual trend has been to more and more recording. And it was actually Barack Obama who recommended, when he was a senator from Illinois, to do the recordings. And then during his presidency was when the federal agents started, where the expectation is in most cases you're going to record rather than it's a rarity.
Well, and I want to shift now because we've talked. There's been a lot of this has been awesome up to this point, but I want to get way into the weeds now, because people really have trouble understanding false confessions. And I know that there are different types of false confessions. So let's talk about those. Okay. And a lot of this is cheating. DeClue cheated, let me in on this. So I'm not so smart. This is why you get an expert, because they tell you all the answers ahead of time. But let's break down the different types of false confessions so that we can really get in the weeds about why people do this. So what is a voluntary false confession?
So a voluntary false confession is when a suspect decides to tell the police that he committed a crime, and I'll just use he for convenience here. It could be he or she. That the suspect tells the police, "I did it," knowing that the suspect didn't do it. There's not any persuasion from the police. It's just a person decides to say, "I did it." There are a few reasons for that. One can be sort of fame. I believe, if I've got the facts right here, the John Bennett Ramsey, that there was a confession in that case that seemed to be she's really famous and somebody confessed. Years ago, the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, and a lot of people confessed to that for whatever reason. Some of them were apparently not induced by the police. So voluntary just means I choose to do it of my own free will without being talked into it or tricked into it by the police.
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't even thought of this until you were talking about it. When I was a prosecutor, I had a false confession case that I fought like the Dickens to drop. And I remember now looking back, it was interesting. I hadn't even made this connection, but it was a juvenile who was accused by his stepmother of molesting his sister, who was the stepmother's daughter, right?
Uh-huh.
And he did not do it. I'm telling you, I know he didn't do it because
Uh-huh.
I've had sex at least once, and I can tell you his description of sex was not in congruence with the reality, okay?
I
He
see.
did
Uh-huh.
not know what he was talking about.
Okay.
But he wanted out of this house so bad
Mm.
because this stepmother was torturing him for basically months that when the police interrogated him, he's like, "Yeah, I did it." And he was getting, and they said it was interesting because the lead up to it was, "Do you know the difference between a truth and a falsity?" And he's like, "Yes." They said, "Well, what's an example of a true statement?" And he says, "I hate my stepmother." And then they said, "Well, give me a false statement." He says, "I love my stepmother." And then he goes on to describe how he's tortured and molested and had sex with his daughter of this stepmother. And
Mm.
he just said, "I want out of this house. If I go to a commitment program, I go to jail, take me away, get me out of this hellhole," right? And
Mhm,
it
mhm.
was and it was obvious that the girl said nothing happened at all. It was complete 100% confession on this kid, and he just wanted out of this thing. So that would be an example of a voluntary confession, right?
Right,
Or
yeah.
voluntary false confession.
Mhm.
Now the next one is persuaded complaint false confession. What is a persuaded complaint false confession?
So this would be persuaded compliant, to
Oh,
comply
compliant. I'm
with the
I'm
person.
reading your notes. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Persuaded means in this regard that the police persuaded the person to say I did it, and compliant, here means that the person is complying with the pressure or the expectations, and the person knows. And I'll put myself in this situation. I know I didn't do it, but I'm being pressured by the police, and I'm getting to a point where either I'm so uncomfortable, I'm so scared, I'm so tired, I just give up. For whatever reason, I say I did it, even though at the time I don't believe that I did it. So I'm complying with the pressure, and saying I did it, even though I know I didn't do it.
Okay, and so in that sense, there is a knowledge that it's false, but they're doing it to get out of the pressure situation.
Right. For whatever reason, the pressure situation, right. So persuaded, um, the that's a good way to summarize it. I'll just say it could be a little more nuanced, but that's a good
Well,
enough way
give
to
us
put
some
it.
example. Put some meat on the bones. Like describe a situation where a persuaded compliant false confession. What would be kind of a scenario, fact scenario that would describe that situation?
So the every case is different, and the details of each case matter. But in a situation where the police tell somebody, "We've got evidence that shows that you did it. Um, we've got a video," or if they think there were two people involved, the other guy has said that you did it and you're the shooter, and you're going to go down on capital murder, and you know we've got death penalty in this state, and he's already over there talking to my partner over there and saying that you're the shooter. So if you just sit here and say you weren't even there, all we'll have is his statement. Nobody's going to believe you because we've got the video showing you guys walking up there. We've got cell phone. That's going to, that shows that your cell phone was there. Somebody with your face was there, and so on. And this guy says you're the shooter, and you actually had touched the gun, so your fingerprints and DNA are going to be there. So if you just say I wasn't there, I just remind you we got the death penalty in this case, in this state. Or on the other hand, we know that you did it. We know that you were there. Maybe you weren't the shooter. He seems like a really bad guy. You don't seem like such a bad guy. He's got a record after all. You've mostly been pretty good. I think you were just along for the ride. But you got to tell us something to take to the prosecutor, or the prosecutor's not going to believe you, and you're going to end up with a capital charge.
Now,
They'll
Derna
use some
here,
of those words, and then the
yeah.
person in that situation can say, "Shit, I better say I did it." I mean,
Well,
excuse me, I better say
yeah,
I
I
did it.
got you. It's okay. We're all good fun.
Right.
Derna 1804 says, "See, you don't know DeClue and I. He and I are like, I don't know. For some reason, we have a connection, and I love it because you're my kind of guy, and I love listening to you. Um, but in this case, see, people don't realize how the effect of low IQ. People at that moment when they're making that statement of police, they believe that this will the advantage of making these false statements to the police in persuasion outweighs the cost of what they are. Now, that is completely stupid, right? Because we know that they're going to get crushed by this statement in court. But in that moment, when they're in that high pressure situation, maybe it's IQ, maybe it's willpower, whatever it is, their internal calculus is the benefit is for me to make this false statement.
Right. And the way this is described in the literature of people who've studied false confessions, it's a lot of the words you just said. In the unique psychological moment that is largely created by the police in the interrogation room, the suspects comes to view reality from a particular perspective. And in that moment, with the pressure on, and police, many experienced interrogators are quite artful about what they do. And so the pressure is put on and taken back off, put on and taken back off. And so the idea of being able to see to the other side of things and see something coming out positive, the person in that situation can believe parts of the false reality the police are creating for him, or become confused, or just kind of give up. And in that situation, the police actually, in modern American police interrogation, they will deliberately try to make a suspect think it's in the suspect's best interest to say, I did it.
Well, sure, of course. I mean, I think that would be, and I don't even think that's that unfair. I mean, I think, but what happens is when you add these external, you lose the external controls, like recording, hold back listings, right?
Right.
Then that's when the pressures, I mean, the psychological pressures that can be put on somebody can result in false confessions. Now, I'm interested. It's kind of rattling around my head, and there's a couple people in chat saying this, and I keep saying it. But how important is IQ to this?
So there's two answers, and both are true. It is important, but it's not all important. So within the known cases of wrongful convictions from false confessions, there's an overrepresentation of people with low IQ, young people, people with a mental illness, and so on. So you're going to have an innocent person with a low IQ with the same interrogation techniques is going to be at greater risk to falsely confess. But it's important to remember that statistics really do help us understand things if we think about them right. Most people in the United States have more or less average IQ. Think about a bell curve from your science classes or whatever. The majority of people have an IQ that's somewhere between 90 and 110, or 85 and 115, and you've got people smarter and less smart than that. So out of all of the people in the world, or in the United States, to pick a country, a lot of them, many of them, most of them are going to have fairly average intelligence. So this part is not really so surprising. In one time frame, looking at new cases of known wrongful convictions from false confessions, about half of the people who we know they falsely confessed, about half of them did not have low IQ, did not have a mental illness. They were not vulnerable in a psychological sense. They just happened to be a suspect for some reason, and these powerful police techniques were used without sufficient safeguards to recognize that if they got a false confession, they were going to say, oh, your confession doesn't make sense because you didn't get the details right.
Let's see. And oftentimes the intellect can trick you, and people can think themselves right into problems too. So, it's intelligence is an odd thing. It's a very strange concept, and it's independent of who we are. Really, I mean, it's a gift from God, and we don't really have control over it. It's not really who we are. It's just it's an asset that we're given. And then, of course, there's the whole Dunning-Kruger effect, which is fascinating, which people love to battle out, which is that we don't really have a good bead on our intelligence. We usually think that we're more intelligent than we are. And we don't realize that somebody who is trained in interrogation techniques, who has spent years and gone through hundreds and hundreds of interrogations and reviewed them, has such a huge advantage over us in any kind of interaction when they're seeking a goal of getting you to confess, that they're outclassed.
Right. So with regard to parts of what you mentioned, in an interrogation room, we talked about intelligence a little bit in this conversation, and another way to look at that a little bit more broadly, it goes to some of the other things you were saying. You've got two people, sometimes it's more than two in the interrogation room, but you've got one or more police officers and a suspect. If the police officer is more I'm going to say interpersonally dominant than the suspect, then there's a greater risk for the suspect to be boxed in or overwhelmed or talked into or confused, etc. So part of that has to do with intelligence. Part of it has to do with experience. Part of it has to do with the situation where sometimes the interrogation might take place in the suspect's home or just outdoors, but often it's going to be either in a police car, police interrogation room, at a police station. So the suspects in this, they're not in their turf, they're not in their comfort zone. At some point, and sometimes it's a surprise, at some point the suspects realize, wow, I'm a suspect. They think I did this thing. And not only they think I might have done it, they're convinced that I did do it. So there's the thoughts are churning. Even in addition to intelligence, you've got intellectual efficiency of being able to think straight, keep things straight at the time. And then you throw in that the cops are trained to and have experience and practice in asserting themselves in a one-to-one encounter, so that they will interrupt the suspect, and that's right in the training manual, and seize control of the interview, use their dominance. And remember, the police, as they're being interpersonally dominant, can and sometimes do just insert false things into the narrative that they think will help convince the person to admit to something. And once the police think you did it, they know there's some limits, and especially if they're recording, they know there's certain things they can't do. But once they think that they're talking to the guilty guy, they're motivated to see if they can get a confession out of this, and
Sure.
they'll use what they think might work. They'll watch the suspect, and if they can see a vulnerability, they'll zone in on there.
Now, the third, say, type of false confession that you've identified for me is persuaded internalized false confessions. So what is persuaded internalized false confessions?
So the persuaded part is the police persuasion, or trying to talk somebody into something, or using their techniques. Internalized means for that psychological moment, largely created by the police, the person comes to believe something along these lines. I did it. I must have done it. Perhaps even though I don't remember doing it, I must have done it. So the person, when he says I did it, is actually thinking that I think I did it. I think I must have done this thing. The words you mentioned earlier where, hey, I don't remember, or I'm not sure, or I think I must have done it. Once the once the suspect has said, I think I did it. I think I must have done it. I don't remember, but it sounds like I must have done it, and so on. Then an experienced police officer will often try to move from that to saying, look, is it yes or no? None of this middle ground. And so you end up with a person who is either just saying, okay, I must have done it, and believing that at the moment, or sometimes you have a kind of a combination where they think, I guess I must have done it. So, okay, they're not really lying or falsely saying I did it. But they're moving from, I think I must have done it, to, okay, I did it.
And this is more of the memory creation situation that we had in our case,
Right.
where the person was, I don't remember that. I don't remember that. And then she, and then the cop was saying, well, that's not an acceptable answer. And and then he'd say, you remember this, and you remember hearing this, and you remember the sound of this. And she's like, I do. And then it's amazing. And then she's incorporating this into it. And then it's like, well, and I remember, well, we just want you to apologize to the family. And I remember her filling out the statement, crying and saying, but I didn't do it. And as
Mm,
she's filling out the form, the way that they wanted her to fill out the form, it was frightening to see she was broken down, she was vulnerable, she was agreeable, she was not given the escape hatch of not remembering. The cop then feeds her this information that she doesn't remember, and then she remembers it because
yeah,
it's like she
yeah.
was open, her mind was open, and she was vulnerable. It was frightening, shocking, disappointing, and I really it hurts. That case to me to this day haunts me,
Mm.
and I don't know. So that would be an example of persuaded, internalized false confession. Would you say?
Right, if the person believes it at that moment, and it doesn't mean sometimes it's as soon as the recording's over or even the recording's still on, the police are off, the pressure's gone, or that night in jail, the next morning in jail, the person might say, "What the heck did I just say?" You know, and the that can change at that point. Um, or other times it'll be when there's actually new evidence that they realize that the cops lied to them. If they did, if the police don't
But of
always
course,
lie,
the
but if
people
they
can
did,
even
yeah.
get so persuaded that they remember things that
Mm,
were planted in their heads by the police, which
right,
is what we
yeah,
had in our case, which was she ended up constructing in her mind what she thinks happened, which was contradictory to the evidence
yeah.
because the police thought that's the way it happened.
So let's double back briefly, just from right here to something we were talking about earlier with the safeguards and the holdback list and so on. In this kind of situation where the persuasive techniques the police used on this particular suspect or on a suspect of that type can get the person to give a false confession, like you and I are talking about, and maybe some of the listeners and viewers can sort of get a picture of this. Um, but let's say that in a case like that, the police had used very careful safeguards. They've got a holdback list. They don't, and they're recording the whole time. They don't tell the suspect these details. And so even if they say your husband said you did it, or the other things that are going to tip them to thinking, oh, I must have done it, and then they start remembering. And then if the police say, okay, so you're cooperating, you're doing that, I really appreciate it. You're very impressed with your honesty here. Now, tell me exactly what you did. And then non-leading questions, even if she's come to believe that she did it and she's got some so-called memories about it, the police can just be careful about it. Don't do leading questions, ask specific or ask questions to get specific answers, and then keep going. Eventually, they've got a very detailed thing. And if the suspect is really giving a voluntary true statement, most of those details are going to match.
And that's
There
what we
might
did
be a
not have in
possibility
our
you
we had
miss
a
one, but
recording of the interrogation, which was like
absolutely,
two and a
yeah,
half hours, but we did not have a holdback list. There
right,
was 0 holdback list, and all the details came from the police, and the details that were given were contradictory to the actual evidence in the case. So
right.
and that's what you were, brought in to discuss, and it was so painful, that case. Um,
Mhm.
but, yeah, and it's sad. Let's see. So that's persuaded, internalized false. Is there? Those are the 3 that you've identified. Are there others that are those are the main 3 categories?
I think those dividing false confessions up into those 3 categories is a useful way to look at it.
Okay, so we have
Other
voluntary
experts have
false
divided them
confessions.
differently, but I think that works.
Yeah, voluntary false confessions, persuaded, compliant false confessions, and persuaded, internalized false confessions. Now let's talk about prevention. Obviously we have you give instructor, you also not only do you are hired as an expert in the area of false confessions, but you also do training for police. Is that correct?
Yes, I have done that. Yes,
And so you are available for that kind of consulting anywhere in the US. Is that correct?
that's true. And even outside the U.S. as well. The
Well, and where are you now,
uh,
my
I'm in Austria.
hills are alive friend here?
Yes, I'm in Austria. Let's see. You want? Shall I show the viewers a little
Oh my
scene?
gosh, you're gonna make me so jealous. Go
Yeah,
ahead. Yes, let's
let's
see
see
what.
how this works. So this is out the window
Oh
here.
my goodness.
Yeah.
Look at that. Beautiful.
That
Let's get a
up
better
at
go
the
ahead. Let me
top
see
of
a
the
full
hill
straight on shot
is
outside.
the castle. I don't know if I'll get it on the screen, but
Yeah,
I
we
can
can
look out
see.
the window here and see the castle where the ruins of the castle where Richard the Lionhearted was held captive in about the year 1000. So Yeah,
Wow.
it's historic around here.
That's great. I know Austria is one of those places it's one of those mythical, idyllic thing. Now, is it really the way? Is it really that way, or are we just imagining things?
So my experience is that it's a very real place, and people are real genuine. I enjoy Vienna. I was in Vienna last night, listening to some good blues music, and but I also enjoy going out in the countryside and meeting regular people, and um, very authentic. There's a respect for, the buildings in the town where I live. Some of them are hundreds of years old, and some of them, several hundred years old. And people respect the planet, respect, not everybody, of course, but respect the buildings, and they build on the past rather than tear it down and start all over again. So
Right.
a lot of
And we
things I
need
like.
more constructivity in our society.
Yep.
Well, and I don't know how much time you have because believe me, this is like one of my dream interviews, and I'm so happy that you came on, and I'm so thankful for you for everything you do because it's so important in our profession and to protect the innocent and to make our police better, make our prosecutors better. So thank you for that. So if we can lead into kind of another section, you have this wealth of experience. I mean, how much
Mhm.
time do you have? I don't want to.
Somewhere between 15 minutes and a half hour, up to that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you to relate maybe some of your most memorable cases in your career or things that really jump out that you'd like to share.
Okay. So there are two or three that often come to mind. One of them that I feel really positive about is a 15-year-old kid. Again, as a background in psychology rather than law, I tend to not give names and
Now, don't give
specifics.
names. I'm just talking
Yeah.
fact patterns and.
So yeah. So I'll remind myself as I go along. So a woman was found dead not too far from a trail in a city in Florida. So you got a city in Florida with some trails, not downtown, so to speak, but not way out in the country or anything. She's found not right away, and it got a lot of attention because of the certain demographics about her. It made it seem like it was unsafe in the city, and they wanted to solve the crime because, you know, ordinary. It wasn't like a gang shooting. It was ordinary people for no reason at all, and so on. So there's some pressure on the police in that situation to try to find a conviction. This kid, he's in, I believe, a foster family, if I remember right, and his sister or foster sister notices that something in his room. He's got a wallet or billfold in the room that's not his. It's an adult woman's billfold. And she says to the mom, "What's going on?" The boy says to the mom, "Yeah, well, I found it." So that sounds very suspicious. The mom looks at the name, connects it to, here's this woman who's been found dead, not that far away. And so once the police get this information, the mom takes him in, and the boy starts talking with the police. They went through Miranda, and he said, "I'll talk to you." And so he's answering questions. This actually is the one I was talking about earlier, where there was a detail that the police thought that they had nailed the guy on, bringing up this detail. The woman had been found like under some leaves and such, and the police officer who interviewed the boy was convinced that the boy had told the cop the color of her underwear, and that was a match. And that was a big thing to the police officer. As we went through the details of a long interrogation and what was presented and so on, we realized that the police officer had actually inadvertently said that. And so this kid was charged with a crime because he was underage. He likely would have been in prison for the rest of his life. After it took some time, but the public defender in the case challenged the statement to police. Details came out. The statement, if I remember right, the statement was suppressed so that the jury didn't get to hear it. As the investigation continued, these cases are all sad. You've got an untimely death, but in this case, there wasn't a crime at all. If anybody did it, it was the Sackler family, because what happened is the woman got in an argument with her boyfriend. took some pills with her, went out on the trail and took an overdose of some opiates, either a conscious suicide attempt or an accident. She wasn't found right away. By the time she was found, they figured it was a murder. They found a kid with a billfold. They got a confession out of the kid. And so here, a kid would have been in prison for the rest of his life on the basis of what was eventually considered to be a false confession. And there wasn't even a crime involved.
Right.
So that's one example. Yeah.
Well, and this is well, before we get Lord of the Reid, thank you very much. Good to see you here. Steve, excellent discussion. Thank you for keeping me entertained while I'm working. Well, that's what we do here. Yeah, and this is, yeah, those are such tough cases, and there's something called the corpus delicti rule, which we had in our case, right? In the case that we did together. And of course, we had a horrible judge, Judge Wolf, who was terrible, and he was unfair, and he was caused the wrongful conviction of him and the prosecutors collaborating. And that false confession, well, it came in over a corpus delicti issue, which was one of my issues, one of my reasons I was involved in that case, because there was two theories, like what you were saying in this case. There was a case in which the act that actually occurred was not even a crime. And then there was another interpretation, which it was a crime. Well, before you can bring in a confession, before you can bring it, there has to be a corpus of a crime. And in fact, what we had in this case was there was alternative theories in which it might not even be a crime. And then you can't, the idea is you shouldn't be able to confess to something that's not a crime. And the corpus delicti goes to the body, the core of the body. So for example, I did it. You go in the police station, I killed him. Okay, well, put him away. He's first-degree murder. Yeah, I shot him in the head, right? Well, the idea there is, well, there's no body. There's no crime here. You can't just go in and confess to a crime when there's no body of a crime. So there shouldn't be a confession allowed in before the corpus of the crime is established independently. But of course, in Florida, when you have a judge and we have an appellate system broken, unfortunately, all these rules to protect the innocent are out. And that's to my eternal frustration.
Well, anyway. and I'll just comment that's variable too. You were talking about how police officers, there are plenty of integrity for many officers, and my experience, police officers aren't deliberately trying to get a false confession for somebody, except for very rare circumstances. And I think, in fairness, I've certainly met and worked with prosecutors and judges that I have a great deal of respect for, and then other times where I don't know the whole picture, but sometimes it just doesn't really look right to me from what I see.
Right. Well, okay, and so that's an interesting case. What other cases jump to mind as being like some, they don't have to all be winners. They can be ones that's you still think about to this day.
So I'll stick with winners, at least for the moment. Maybe I'll come up with a one that went the other way. So one case, let's see. So there was a case in Sarasota. There was a person, I was sent there to do a competency evaluation. So competency, as a lot of people know, has to do with, is the person currently able to understand some fairly basic things? What are you charged with? What's the possible penalties? And can they help their attorney with presenting a defense? So I went in to evaluate him for competency. There were definitely some issues, concerns about him from a psychological perspective. Even just the way he answered things, he was saying, sure, yep, in such a confident way, when it appeared to me that on some of those questions, he hadn't even heard the question, but he was agreeing to it. I went back in with my sort of forensic psychology toolkit, and I tested him for suggestibility and IQ and some other issues. On some of those issues, he scored so high, or scored in a direction that he appeared very vulnerable to me. And so I conveyed to his defense attorney, not just whether I thought he was competent or not currently, but that I had a real concern that this could be a case of a false confession. And this was long enough ago that it took a while to get results from DNA testing. And so in some cases where you had a case and a confession and so on, the defense might have pled him out or plead the case. Instead, he put it on hold. It took, I think, a couple of months or longer to get get the results back. And it turned out he didn't commit the crime. The DNA didn't match. And so that was one where it was a mentally ill person who was very cooperative, very agreeable, wasn't even saying right then that, oh, I didn't commit this crime, but a quite confusable person. And because, again, I was just doing a routine competency evaluation, but because of the background and expertise I have, I considered that a possibility, tested for it, and then that led to the attorney to put it on hold, do the DNA testing, and then once the DNA testing came back, they did a more careful look at everything and said, okay, we don't have a case. They dropped the case, and so he wasn't convicted.
Well, and good for the prosecutors for doing that too. I mean,
yeah.
That's an ethical prosecutor. That's one that cares about justice and cares about convicting truly guilty and not innocent people. So kudos to those prosecutors, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Okay, now let's move into, let's have an exit thing, because now everything I've talked to you about is right in your wheelhouse, your expertise.
Okay.
And now we have opinions, and opinions are like, everybody's got an opinion, and we are just, even though we're very educated, our opinions are really just opinions. But I'm going to ask you, based on who you are and what you've experienced, what is your opinion about the ethics, morality, or whatever word you want to put in there, about allowing police to lie to suspects in order to extract confessions?
So a little bit of a nuanced answer. Currently, the official recommendations from police interrogation trainers are to not use false evidence ploys, not use lies with vulnerable suspects, young people, mentally ill people, etc. So there's a few people that they should not use it with at all. For those that they are going to use it as a last result, or if not quite last result, certainly not as a first result, because of the risk of getting a false confession. So so first is, don't use it with certain vulnerable people. Second is, if you're going to use it, don't use it as a first line of defense or first line of attack, let's say. The third is to use false statements by the police to trick a suspect into confessing. I can understand why that would be considered to be both legally and ethically usable, but only if the police apply very careful safeguards. So to my own personal perspective, if you've got a suspect who doesn't appear to be particularly vulnerable, and the police have reason to think that he might have done it, and they think a confession might really turn the tide, if they're very careful about the kind of safeguards, the holdback list and recording and all of that kind of stuff, and they trick a suspect into thinking it's in his best interest, you better confess or the other guy's gonna get you. If the police are very careful about checking those details to make sure that they're getting, we can call it a coerced statement. It's psychologically coerced. I'm comfortable saying that's a psychologically coerced statement when they trick them. If the police are very careful to with all the details so that we know that that's the guy that did it, he proved it by his own statement, then I think it's a matter for the society to decide what's the greater good. And I have not extreme strong feelings one way or the other. The last thing I would say about that is,
one of my concerns. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, one of my big concerns, and I think one of our problems in our society is the declination of morality throughout the society and the individual level. And I think that there's a moral degradation that occurs when police are endorsed and allowed and encouraged to lie, that lie kind of, it's a diminution of our morality as a society. And then it becomes acceptable. If it's okay to lie here, then I can lie on the witness stand and I can lie to get the bad guy. And so I'm very concerned about that line being crossed. Mm-hmm. Are there other countries that do not allow that?
Yes. The biggest model would be the United Kingdom with what they call the PEACE model, PEACE, or the acronym or the letters for it. It doesn't really come from being a peaceful kind of guy, but it does involve some challenging of statements, getting details from the suspect, and it's effective in getting statements from suspects, and it's effective in leading to the truth and getting convictions, and it does not involve deception. And it has become popular because it has grown in popularity,
What is the name of
certainly
the
in
technique
UK
again?
and
Say it
somewhat
again.
in the US. Go ahead.
What's the name of the technique again? What'd you say?
Peace, PEACE, just like the peace sign.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look into that. Now that brings me to my last big topic that I wanted to talk to you about, and
Okay.
it goes back to opinion. And I always bring this up. The standard training now, the hot interrogation technique is called the Reid technique, REID, I believe, Reid technique.
Right.
And what is your opinion of the Reid technique? And can it be improved? And or are there internal safeguards that are just not followed? Could you talk about the Reid technique for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So I underwent training on the Reid technique myself because as an expert witness, I want to understand what it is that I'm critiquing sometimes. And I've read their manuals, I've written about it in peer-reviewed journals, and I've talked with directly some of the people who do the training there. There's a lot of things I can say about it. It is an effective way of getting more confessions from both guilty and innocent suspects. So if you use the Reid technique, you'll get more people to confess than if you use some other approaches. But some of the people that confess will be confessing falsely. Within the Reid technique, I think this is a fair criticism. In my experience, when I went to the training, well, let me start one step before that. When I read the books in the manuals and on the online in the official publications from Reid, they recommend safeguards very similar to what I just described. And some of the papers that I've written with police interrogation trainers have been incorporated and put on the website of Reid, and they basically recommend using techniques like this. However, when I went to the training in person, and it was I think a 4-day training in Orlando, it was hardly mentioned about false confessions, and it was hardly mentioned about doing these safeguards. So what you have here is, I think this is fair to say, and I'll say in my opinion, in my experience, what I think I see with Reid is that they're careful to have, let's say, cover your ass material in the books and online to say, do a holdback list. They recommend a holdback list, but many of the people who go to the Reid training don't hear about a holdback list. So you have people who are trained in the Reid technique who will get a false confession and get a wrongful conviction from the get a wrongful conviction in the case, thinking that they followed the Reid technique and not even realizing that Reid itself has said, oh, don't do that, do it in this careful way. So that's all one part of it. One other thing to add is that there's been so much criticism of Reid, including in Canada, that Reid itself is now teaching the peace method as well as the traditional Reid method. So you can go to Reid and sign up for peace training because they saw they were losing their dollar base because people were saying, oh man, that's a problematic training method. I want the peace training. And so they want a piece of that pie too. So to sum up, Reid is effective at getting confessions, sometimes false confessions. If you're very careful about it, they do recommend the safeguards that should be used. But unfortunately, at least so far in my experience, the trainers are not focusing on the things that I think must be focused on, and that is,
Well,
there
yeah.
are false confessions, and let's make sure we don't get one here.
Well, well, this goes back to the thing is that Reid needs not just to be a recommendation, it needs to be a requirement. They must record everything, investigate the crime beforehand, write down facts, create a holdback list. And
Right.
those are essential. And I think that the recording and the holdback list are so important for rooting out a lot of this dangerous stuff that's being played around with psychology and individuals. And I thank you so much for joining me. Can just tell everybody again, how can they contact Dr. DeClue if they have a question about interrogations in their case?
So I do have a website. You can find it by putting Greg DeClue homepage into a search, or alternatively, Greg or Gregory DeClue, psychologist, Florida, should also get to you to my homepage. You'll find an email, phone number, and oh, by the way, the articles that I publish, I put them right there on the website. So not only is there a link to my book, which you'd have to buy, but there's probably about 40 articles that are totally free. You can grab them right there.
Well, God bless your work. God bless you. You're one of those experts. Like, this is an academic area. It's not like you're not arguing amongst academics about the head of a pin. This is stuff that is meaty, is meaningful, that is important. And I really thank you for devoting your life to this very important topic, and keep up the good work. And just hold on a second. We're going to shut down here, but hold on just a second and we'll talk for a second. Thank you all, and we'll be in touch. And there's all kinds of good stuff coming up tomorrow. I've got Dr. Scott Gerber talking about the Constitution and jurisprudence, and he's a law professor. So that's tomorrow night. So thanks a lot, everybody.